Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Love Well podcast. My name is Anna,
And my name is Marlen.
and we are so excited you guys are joining us today. We actually have a very special treat for you guys because I don't know if you guys have been listening to the other episodes, but we have been sharing a lot of our friends that we know their stories of immigrating to the US and what it was like for them.
Mhm.
And so we were thinking, what better way to include in this episode than to have our own co host, Marlen, share her story and a little bit about how she grew up in Honduras and what it was like immigrating to the US and um, continuing to be in the US as a citizen. And so, Marlon, will you just tell us again what your ethnic background is and just tell us a little bit about Honduras and what it was like growing up there?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. I'm super excited to be able to share some of my story at the same time as we acknowledged in the previous episode. Like, it can be a little bit vulnerable to step into parts of our story because, you know, I know from a personal experience, sometimes I don't share as often the harder parts as well.
Mm,
But I do think that um, in this space, I felt very called to, be able to share part of of my story with that. And I want to be able to provide some context too into what growing up in Honduras look like. I have had conversations with friends and they ask me all the time, and I love when they ask me, like, tell me about your country. Because after living here for 6 years, I have come to learn and experience in some ways too that some people don't know about Honduras. And I mean, I don't blame them. Honduras is a very small country where it's 9 million people. So we're in context to, like, the US is massive. So
yeah.
it makes sense. So I want to provide a little bit, I want to tell you a little bit more about my country and in relation to, like, the world and, like, the world standards, because I think that that's helpful. I love when I hear people from other countries share about their corner of the world, because it's just different.
Yeah.
So anyway, so Honduras is part of Latin America, and in Latin America, I know that some people have. It's easy to assume. I just want to say, I know it's easy to assume, and I know many immigrants that are from Latin America that come from smaller countries. People have assumed that we come from Mexico, Mexico, and a lot of times, like, I remember once I was asked, like, "Oh yeah, what part of Mexico is Honduras in?" And I'm like, it's its own country. So you get giggles and also, like, oh, okay, well, I guess that, not a lot of people know about us. So anyway, all that being said, yeah, Honduras is a small country, 9 million people. Uh, we are a beautiful country. Uh, Lots of natural resources. We actually have. I love to share this part always. We have, like, we're part of the Mesoamerican coral reef barrier. So we have, like, the second
Oh, wow.
largest coral reef in the world. Like, when you go to our Bay Islands, you get to see, like, I mean, people from all over the world do come to Honduras to scuba dive and get certified and all those things.
Hmm.
So we have mountains where depending on what part of Honduras you go, if you go to the coast, that's where I grew up. You will have beach, you will have mountains. Beautiful, very, very beautiful. If you go to where my parents live now, it's on the west side of Honduras. It's a little bit of a colder weather. That's where coffee farms. It's very agricultural. So you will
Mm-hmm.
see that. If you go to the more southern part, you will have the capital, which is Tegucigalpa in Honduras, and there's more, like, businesses and, like, uh economic development in that sense, and job opportunities and all that. So anyway, quick overview. We are also known as a third world country. There is a lot of poverty. More than half of Hondurans live in poverty, and
Hmm. Wow.
poverty not in terms of US standards. It's different. It's a different kind of poverty. But when you put it to world standards, like, you will find people in Honduras that live with, like, $1 a day or less than $1 a day.
Mm.
Um, And there's a lot of also wealth disparity. There's a very small percentage of Hondurans that have a lot of wealth. And that is usually comes with political and business owning and that play into that, and a very small percentage that is like middle class. And that's where I fall within my context. I grew up middle class in within Honduras. Definitely, when I moved here, I quickly learned that middle class in my country is not middle class in the U.S. For sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
And to give further context with that, like middle class in my context meant, and I think Melissa shared a little bit of that, in it's like having access to education. Thankfully, our education
Mhm.
is not as expensive. Like, again, we can't put it into US standards of even having a private bilingual education, which is what I had, which is the reason why a lot of people ask me, hey, how do you speak English? This is, it's hard. Their brains are computing on like, wait, how do you speak English? And so I help explain people, like, I went to a bilingual school, and
Mhm.
being a part of middle class is that. Also, it meant having a car. I remember when I was a preteen, that's when my family was able to afford to buy a car. So when you have a
Hmm.
car, it's a means of transportation for us. So people think, oh, you have money, you know? So,
Yeah.
and it's funny because the first car we bought, it's the same car that still my parents still drive to this day. And it's a 2001 Honda CRV. That thing's still kicking. But
That's
even
awesome.
that, it's not, and I found when I moved to the US, it's not if you have a car, because having access to getting a car, even if it's like a beat up car, it's a car. It's what kind of car, right? So here the question becomes more like what kind of car you have, then you have a car. So
How
just
many?
to, or how, I mean, how, that honestly
Yeah.
shocked me. Um, in average here, almost everyone here has a car, because
Yeah,
you
if
need
you're a
it.
family of 4, you need 2 cars.
For sure, yeah. And in my context, we're a family of five, so I'm the middle child. I have an older sister, younger brother, and then my parents, and we shared one car. So like then
Mm.
having to for all of my life, having to figure out. My dad did get to have a company car when I got older, so but we were not allowed to use that at all. So that meant that the four of us, my mom, my sister, my brother, and I had to share it. There's lots of fights, lots of discussions, lots of
I
arguments, but
bet.
yeah. So that, just to provide a little bit of context within that, it is a country that uh, has a lot of government corruption, that it has a lot of gang violence. So, to give you more of an idea of what kind of growing up looked like for me, so even though I was middle class, my neighborhood where I grew up was a mix of many things. So you would find people like one of my neighbors, he owned a business that was pretty successful. So his house was really nice. Then you had people like myself who my parents were able to um, have their own house, but my dad was working under someone else. We didn't own a business or anything.
Mhm.
But also, like, right on top of next to my house, we had squatters and people that you would see like the wooden houses, and kind of like what people have the idea of like when they think about a third world country. And it was like right next to like my house, like in the back. And 2 minutes from my house was one of the like there's just gangs, and gang activity. So, and it was funny because I was thinking about my story, and I was like, oh yeah, like we were all there together. um which then
Mm.
led to my church reflecting my community. So a part of my church, one of the things that, man, I do love about the way we did church was that it did reflect that. It reflected that we
Right.
had extreme poverty the
Yeah.
people that were living in those conditions to business owners, you know? And with that came a lot of things. I think also in thinking now from a um, social aspect of Honduras, classism is a big part of that because it's like a big disparity within like what the country looks like. It is a thing, that
Mm.
we have to address, and I think that as a church is something that was addressed and made a point, that in that part we were being inclusive and serving the people. So that is definitely one of my favorite parts about having growing up in the way that I grew up. Yes, was there a lot, and I think Melissa, like, she mentioned this in the previous episode of when we were little kids, we were able to be out and about, and until it got dark, we would get back into our houses. But then things started shifting in our country, and it got to a point that by the time I was 8 or 9 years old, it was not safe anymore for us to play outside.
Mm.
And that was increased. I mean, there's so many things. It would take a podcast of its own to just go into all the layers. And I don't know if anyone ever would want to go deeper into that, would love to. But yeah, things changed. And that meant we couldn't play outside anymore. It was not safe to do so. So
Mm.
the way that life happened shifted very drastically. And another aspect of growing up as a kid where that started shifting, um, there's a lot of things that there's a lot of fear that obviously came with that. I think a lot of like awareness that our time is very limited. Another aspect that I want to hit on a little bit deeper is what Melissa said is like death is something we see from a young age. And to share a part
Yeah.
of my personal story, I was around 9 years old when my aunt and my cousins and her entire family were murdered in their house. And I remember that vividly. Like to this day, I remember every single detail and like everything that happened. So obviously that as an 8, 9 year old, you're like, oh wow, like I'm
Right.
that's not okay. Like, whoa, this is life. So you grow up really quickly. Like there's aspects of that.
Mm.
But I want to also and to the point like when it becomes normal. And that's hard for me to say because after going to therapy and now here in the US I had the option to do so. You realize like that was normal in my context. That was
Dang.
just like, oh yeah, you get used to like hearing gunshots. It's like, oh
Mm.
wait, was
Wow.
that a fireworker gun? Oh wait, no, I think that was a gun. So things that then now that I live in this context are wild. When I tell people,
Yeah.
they're like, wait, what? Like, let's roll it back. And I'm like, oh yeah. And then I was like, oh wait, no, like that was normal in my context, but to other people in the world, especially in the developed world, is like mind boggling. So
Man.
yeah, those things like there are so many parts of our stories where death is just a reality. Like we lost so many people within our church community uh, to gang violence or theft. And it was painful. It was really,
Mm.
really painful. I mean, by the time I was 15, we lost a very, in my neighborhood, one of our friends was murdered. And it was very, very sad in a very violent way. I saw him dead on the floor, and because it happened like right there. So yeah, those are some of the things that we get to experience. I mean, I'm a gun survivor myself. I have experienced kidnapping. So it's parts of our stories that are hard, but I also want to make sure to point out that even though we went through all of these things, when I look back at my childhood, we had so much joy.
Mm.
We had so much resilience and we lamented
Yeah.
together as a community. And there was so much power in that. And now that I live in this context, like I'm like, whoa, 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 like look back at those things. You went through some of the most imaginable, like just survival things, like things that, in my context were normal, quote unquote normal, but like, wow, how as a community we came together. Especially
Mm.
when
Yeah.
one of our friends was murdered and in the neighborhood. And also like everyone in the neighborhood knows each other. So that was family, you know? Um,
Yeah.
everyone knew each other and they were like, my friend, and they were like, he was killed. And one of our neighbors saw when that happened, and then just all of us collectively coming together and grieving and lamenting that, and how powerful that is. And I think that uh, that is just something so beautiful too. We are a people that go through a lot of things, that survive a lot of things, and are a people that are full of resilience and hope and dependence in the Lord. And it's
Mm.
something that it's funny because we mentioned a little bit about being hosts for Americans. Like that was also something normal within my context in our church because of the work we did in our community. We had a lot, and still to this day, we have a lot of partnerships with people here in the US. So, uh, having, as we say, gringos in our home since I was very young, that was normal too. Uh, and that was a great a great part of bringing other people into the work that we're doing, to help others. And I just want to note, because I know that in the previous episode there are some things that we named and mentioned about Americans coming to third world countries and doing short-term mission trips. We got to share a little bit of our experience of having two realities of like, oh, we experience Americans in our context and were so loving and came and served us. But when we immigrated here, the experience was different. But I also want to go out of my way and just make sure that I know, because I know a lot in the Christian circle is pretty normal for a lot of people to go on short term missions. I mean, that's how I met my husband, John. On a
Yep.
short mission trip. So I want to say, yes, there are ways. I have had many experiences. Again, would have to spend many hours on talking about that. But we experience it seeing it done well, and then we experience
Mm.
it done it with the wrong intentions. So it's not
Right.
like, oh, it's wrong to do short term mission trips. No, that's not what we were trying to say. But I think the intention behind it is very tangible to the people that receive it. And I can say that from my firsthand experience of hosting people in my homes that were from here. So yeah, I think it's just important to name that too. Like there's good ways, like long-term relationships that are still held to this day. And there are other people that just do it for the checklist. And that was evident as well. So
Mm.
anyway,
That's
just
good.
a
Yeah.
little parentheses, because when people hear our podcast, I don't want it to be like, oh, to bring shame to certain aspects, but we just name truths. And sometimes also we all experience things from different ways, right? And it's important to
Mm.
hear from all the different perspectives on
Right.
how we're experiencing that. So we gave you a peek into like what some of our personal experiences from the receiving end of things are. And I think that's important for you all to hear it
Yeah.
too and be cognizant and aware of that. When you do go to third world countries, it's like, what is the intention that you're going with? And I think that that's a question that should be asked for anything we
How are
do,
you coming
right?
across
Yeah.
even? Yeah.
How are you coming across? Like,
Yeah.
um, are you, and that we mentioned the savior complexity and
Yeah.
mentality. And I did see it. I did experience it. That was a thing. But I also experienced people that sat in our tables during dinner and like, tell us about you and your story. And that was beautiful. And we got to
Mm.
share and we were crying and together, and they got to hear a different perspective. So, it's the both and. It's not either or.
Mm,
But it is important to note that, and I think it needs to be talked about more. And you hear it from us, that people that you are coming here to serve us, how we are experiencing that as well, you know.
yeah, that's so
Yeah,
good, Marlon.
yeah,
Okay, so do you want to tell us a little bit about when you immigrated to the US
yeah,
and just share a little bit about the process of how it was coming here? Obviously, bittersweet, I would imagine. But just kind of give some of that as well.
for sure. No, and that's a perfect segue into what I have shared about missionaries, because as I mentioned, that's how I met my husband. So cue in, I am 18 years
Yes.
old, and here comes John Lane. I'm not going to go into the whole, like our whole love story and all of that. Um, because maybe when we do have him as a guest here, we can go more into that. I really enjoy telling our story from both sides, because we experience it very differently. From like the first time we met, it was two different experiences. Uh, I actually did not like him, but we're not going to get into that. Uh,
We'll let him
so
defend himself.
well, yeah, yeah, no, 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 yeah, yeah. So hey, I'm sharing my side of the story. But anyway, I was 18 when I met John, and it was 2013. It was during a short-term um mission trip. Super honest, for me it was just like, oh, he's another gringo that's passing by, and I didn't think much about it. For him it was a different story. But anyway, he leaves. We just add each other in socials, that's it. Then he comes back the following year, the in 2014, during summertime, and that was the time that for the first time we actually talked longer. And I was like, oh, he's a pretty great guy. That's it though. That's it. Afterwards, I actually reached out to him because they hosted my dad, like his church here in the US, and my church back in Honduras they still have a long-standing relationship. So I actually met his dad before I met John. So, that has just been there. And so they hosted my dad here in the US, because they were like getting support and just talking about their partnership. So I just thanked him. And if he was saying this part of the story, he said that at that moment he decided, if I'm gonna keep talking to this girl until she marries me, or until she tells me to back off. And
Okay,
here
John.
we are. So I know, I was like, okay, bold.
A man after
But
what he wants. We like
look,
it.
look. There's a lot in between there, but long story short, we were friends for about a year. We talked like long distance. Again, so we're in two countries apart. Um, we both had just started college. So we would talk. In the beginning, not often, but we would like just check in. And then after being friends for a year, uh, we started having feelings for each other more than just friendship. And we dated for 2.5 years. Again, there's a lot of that has gone through, like, that's there. I'm not gonna go into all of it, but we dated long distance, countries apart, 2.5 years. And then in 2017, when we got engaged, we started talking about, okay, where are we going to live? That was the question. And for a hot minute we actually thought about living in Honduras. John
Mm,
had, because of our when we were dating, he visited Honduras a couple of different times. He actually lived there for a couple months on two different occasions. Not only for myself, he also served with an organization and with our church. He also learned Spanish while he was there, so he got to see my culture, live with my culture. He loves it. He Every time, like, everyone in my family and our church growing up, they call him the gringo catracho, because that man has a love for people, which honestly, I
yeah.
mean, it's beautiful. As someone who married him, like, he honors, celebrates my culture, and
Yeah.
he learns from us in a beautiful way. So anyway, yeah, we then were like, okay, John's Spanish is good, but also we were cognizant of the fact that it was not good enough for him to be in the Honduran like
Mm,
labor force. It just was not gonna
different.
be it was yeah, it was he was not at that level, and it's okay, you know? So also job opportunities are not the same. So we're like, okay, let's look into moving to the US. What does that look like for me? I shared preview
Mm,
a couple episodes ago what that specifically looked like. I came through with a through a fiance visa to get my green card and become a permanent resident. And that's a whole lot of story there. Which I shared a lot of it when we talked about, hey, what it looks like to get in line or what it looks like to go through the process.
right.
And I did make it very clear that my process is one of the easiest ones, even though it has a lot of hardship and oof, you need a lot of patience and all of it and all of that. Yeah, it's still, you know, there's hardships that come with that. So then I
Mm,
immigrate here in 2017. We get married, and I didn't have, because of all the legal stuff that we had to go through, like getting to our wedding was, wow, just a battle of itself. And on the legal aspects, just the wedding itself obviously is super stressful. And then add like, oh yeah, we have to uh, work with embassies here in the US, embassy in Honduras. We have to send emails and paperwork and all that. So those two things, I was
mm.
so busy and consumed with like, oh, I'm moving, that I didn't really process my move in a lot of ways. Like I knew
Yeah,
I was going to leave
that's
my home and everything I knew, but I didn't know that I was going to leave my home because we're just processing. I'm like, okay,
hmm.
we're, you know, in love and all colored rose glasses, and it's like it's exciting, right? It is exciting. And at the same time, obviously, I'm leaving everything that I know. So forward to we get married, we have a beautiful wedding, we go on our honeymoon, we come back to Charlotte. This is around November 2017, and it hits me first. I am welcomed by to what a lot of locals at that time had said was one of the worst winters that they had
Oh gosh.
experienced. And I was like, great, because before moving, everyone told me like, oh, Charlotte, yeah, it has great weather, like it's very mild, the weather, the winter is mild. And I was like, okay, perfect. Hey, I grew up on the coast, tropical weather, humidity all year round, I'm good. You know, that's great. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Uh, I come in, it was 30 degrees Fahrenheit, which was an adjustment because we use Celsius. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is just cold. So that was 0 degrees Celsius for us. And I'm like, oh, well, this is freezing. I get sick. I only come to the US with, I think I had two, like my whole life in two bags, all my clothes,
Mm,
shoes, and just what I could bring on an airplane. And I was like, okay, well, way to welcome me with a lot of, it's very cold. I get sick that night. We get home to our one bedroom apartment, and yeah, we started. And the first couple of weeks is like, okay, I'm going to unpack. So I do all that. And then it starts to hit me. I'm alone, you know, like like
mm.
John was at work. He didn't work from home at that time. And he would go from 9 to 5. And it was just me at home all day. At that point, as
Yeah,
I shared before, for the first 9 months, I'm unable to work because I'm still
right.
waiting on my green card and on my work permit. I'm unable to drive. I'm unable to do anything, and I'm in a new country where I
Mm,
know no one. You know, so after 3 weeks, I it starts hitting me like, oh, I don't have my family here, you know? And something that Melissa mentioned that I'm like, it gave me language even, is the concept of home. It's not even just,
right.
yes, I have all these layers, but my family is home. and that's all I knew. And because of all the things that we've endured together, like we're a super close knit family, like super, super close.
Mm-hmm.
Like my siblings are my best friends. So, I was
Yeah.
like, oh, shoot, like my people, and then even though I'm fully bilingual, like I am able to speak the language, which I know the privilege that comes with immigrating with knowing English. Oof, so much. It still was a change, I'm like, oh, it's not Spanish anymore. That's not the main language that
Right.
I'm hearing, So I was surprised by that fact. I'm like, oh, I'm bilingual. I should be good. No, it's like there's this language is also a part of like that makes you feel at home. It does. It's the
Yeah.
familiarity, and then all of a sudden it felt foreign, and I'm like, then I start continuing going through the process. We get plugged into a church, which honestly was a gift. I looked forward to Sundays.
Mm-hmm.
But Anna, there were days that I would not talk to a soul until John came back. So when he came back from home, I'm like, oh, hey, human
How
interaction.
you
Let's
been?
go. This is great. Like, but that really affected me. I went through a season of deep depression. I was
Mm,
like, it was hard. I'm like, yes. Do I live financially stable for like really well? Yes. Do I have all of my basic needs met? 1000%. Yes. I even have more. Oh, I can go, I love shopping. So I was like,
mm,
oh, I actually have money to, not wait a couple months and get something. But I mean, I just have the access, the privilege to be able to do all these things.
right.
Um, Even going out for a walk was a privilege in itself.
Mm,
And I was like, oh, obviously I'm not going to go during the night. Like there has to be, discernment in that. Like that can become dangerous to anyone. But just even going out for a walk without having to worry about all the layers and things like for my context.
right. And how
Uh,
interesting that like you were saying before there were so many things that happened in your community in Honduras
mhm.
that were, violent related, all
Yeah.
of these things, but yet and like you said it was resilience and I think a
Yeah.
matter of community that kept you
Yeah. The
hopeful
community.
and still having
1000%.
like a sense of joy. And
Yeah.
yet then when you came here, you still had all the material things or like you
Hmm.
said, the basic needs.
Yep.
You had all of the stuff that you could really dream of, I guess, in a
Yeah.
sense.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
But
Like I
that
made it out in
community
my
was
country.
lacking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now you're, battling with depression. I just find that so
Yeah.
interesting that
Oh,
in a
yeah.
different environment with different things, we can go through such different seasons.
Oh, for sure. For sure. For sure. And I know that it comes with immigrating. Actually, there's now that I've lived here enough and I've gone through therapy myself, which that isn't a whole other thing of its own to actually got to that point of actually seeking help for what I was going through because I was like, "Oh my gosh, the world feels overwhelming. I don't know what's happening." It's comes with
Mm,
immigrating, right? It comes actually there's an interesting study that a counselor once shared. He does like studies and research, and he found that it was interesting how a lot of people that previously had not that from different countries that immigrated to the US had not experienced depression or anxiety, which
hmm.
is could be a very ironical. I'm like, how funny.
Interesting.
uh,
Yeah.
but when they come to the US they start experiencing depression and anxiety. There's many reasons to that from my
Wow.
experience and what I've seen, but I thought when he said that and he shared that, I was like, "Oh, you know,
Mm,
that's wild," because
yeah.
from my conversations and the things that I've talked to with people, like, and I'm not going to shame anybody for experiencing depression and anxiety. However, it is interesting how, because of the way in community and our culture works, it helps battle against those. And believe me, it doesn't mean that there's people in my country that don't experience severe depression because it is a thing. I remember people growing up
Right.
who experienced
Right.
severe depression and anxiety, and also, but not in the numbers that we see here as a society, which
Right. Right.
which, him, an American, doing this kind of study, I found it very, very interesting. And for me, it helped me understand, I'm like, oh, it's, you grew up in a different culture where the things that just are valued are a little bit different. And I
Yeah, that's what I was gonna
quickly,
say.
yeah,
It's the valuables
yes,
versus the,
yeah,
the value of where you place your value is,
absolutely. Yeah.
material items,
Oh,
like
yes.
you were talking about a car. I mean, having transportation,
Yeah. You
or
see it as a
having
means of, yeah, I
all
mean, a
these cars in
house.
a
Yeah.
garage. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's different. And I mean, we could go into a whole, I have many thoughts on that as well. And just
Yeah.
many things that just were very overwhelming at first. Like for someone that grows up within a context where that is not the norm, the amount of
Mhm.
also wealth and resources and opportunities, like to this day, it's been 6 years and there are things that I learn for the first time on how like the opportunities and resources that are available. And I look at my husband, John, I'm like, wait, that's a thing? I
Mm,
like in a million years, what have I thought? Like, there's just things here that are just non-existent. Like they're not even a thought or like
right.
in other contexts. So it's something that I still navigate through and it's like, oh, well, okay, good to know that's something. And another layer that we can add on to like, oh wow, like there's perspective, right? Perspective with
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
realities here. And I'm never going to discount for sure. I've worked in the nonprofit space and working with marginalized communities here in the US. And I'm like, oh, yes, we have a lot of work to do for sure, for sure. And acknowledge the
Yeah.
fact too that there are realities where even those resources and things that we are being very critical of do not exist in other contexts. So anyway, all that
Yeah.
to say,
That's good.
getting back into just the season of immigrating and having to learn all the processes, like the okay, how even I had to learn to pump my gas. We don't do that. Like in the whole country in Honduras, no one pumps their own gas for many reasons. I think one being just safety and like security and avoiding theft for sure. But that was the thing. And I will be honest, Anna, for the first year or 2 years, I felt like a little kid because I
Mm.
had to relearn and everything was new, like self checkout. Not a thing. So I'm like, I don't know how to do. I'm like, even like, I'm like, I swear I've seen how you put your credit card in, but having to do it yourself, just things that seem
Yeah.
dumb because they're normal here, right? Things that might seem like,
Right.
oh, well, but I felt like a little kid because, when you're younger, you see it and then you do it. But I'm an adult, I'm 22 years old. And I'm like,
Right.
it felt also even in that, it shook a lot of my confidence. It shook a
Mm.
lot of, um, I'm like in my home country, I went to, I have a bachelor's degree in marketing, and I knew my country, I knew the space, I worked there. I know the people, I know how things work. And then you come here
Mhm.
and it's like, oh, nope, 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 I don't know that, I don't know
Different
that, oh,
way.
that's okay, oh. And everything is also so big here in the US, like everything.
I do feel like
uh
that when I like ever go to Europe. It's like, wow, this is tiny.
oh yeah, well, like, and you'll find that when you order coffee, like the
Oh
sizes here,
yeah.
y'all. No, like for us, a large is a small here back home. Like yeah, a small
Mhm.
cup, like a whatever, like
I
when you go
believe
to
it.
Starbucks. I remember, yeah, that was overwhelming. I was like, oh my gosh, everything. And then the meals for the first 2 years, I would not eat like everything on my plate because I'm like, this could feed so many people right now. We would always have, well, John loved it because he's like, ooh, I get more. So he would just see what I would order and then wait to say, oh, okay, great, I know that at least half of that is going to be given to me. And we're not going to go into the whole that all like health and food and that, because it did affect me too also. When I
Oh
moved
yeah.
here, my stomach was a mess
Mm.
because I was not as used to processed foods as highly processed as they are here. So,
Yeah.
I mean, to the point that by year 2, I think it was 2018 or 2019, I forget. I got gallstones and I got my gallbladder removed. So I don't have a gallbladder. So I'm like, thank you, America, for doing
Thanks, America.
that.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
Oh man.
But anyway, so getting back to my story, after going through that season of just overwhelming amount of change, overwhelming amount of different, not having what now I know, like, what home was for me, familiarity, even the fact of just being known in the sense of like
Mm,
people just knew me growing up, my
yeah.
neighbors knew me, but here feeling like a complete stranger, like
Yeah. It's like you said, the
eh,
familiarity is just
familiarity, yeah. Even,
priceless, you
and
know?
then I came to notice too, even neighbors hear people, it's rare because there are people that I do know that they're like, oh yeah, I know my neighbors, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I love that. But
Hmm.
people don't know each other, and if anything, they avoid each other. Like there's whole memes and jokes about like when you see your neighbor and you like go hide, or you try to avoid them,
Yeah.
because but it's a cultural aspect, which I have many thoughts about, but just it made me sad that I didn't it wasn't the norm anymore, and
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
had to grieve that. I had to grieve that. So there was just a lot of grieving in many, many different ways. And add on to
Yeah.
that, I just got married. So I'm trying to figure out um, just marriage on its own. I'm trying to figure
Yeah.
out I'm trying to figure out marriage on its own. We're newlyweds,
And you're
and
young,
we're
trying to
I mean,
figure out yourself still.
girl, I'm like, we got married at 22.
I know.
I'm like, we were babies. We were babies. So, imagine that little baby just going through all these things at once. But I will
It's a
have to
lot.
say this too. Like, it was a lot. It was a lot. And yet, how beautiful how God put specific people that became community.
Mm,
And our church was a big part of that too, um,
yeah.
provided community, and it became a second home, So it
Yeah.
was
That's
it, it was
perfect.
beautiful, yeah, in that way too of and within that there were good and bad experiences within my church context. Like there were things that a lot of people had never interacted with someone that had just moved
Mm,
and to the US and they were like, oh, I would get a lot of assumptions, a lot of ignorant comments, a lot of racist comments too, and it was frustrating. So then I'm like, oh, I am a minority in this country. Like even like
mm,
identity wise, oof. I was like, I'm a minority. Oh, this is what people think about immigrants. And
mm.
this is the boxes and these are the stereotypes of people like me that come from my country. And
Right.
even then when I didn't fit those stereotypes, they're like, oh, like what are you? Like
I'm confused.
I'm confused. No, seriously, like even they're like, oh wow, but even the saying of your English is so good. I remember when I was back in Honduras and I would get that from Americans. I'm like, oh thanks, it's a compliment. My English is so good. And then I come here and I keep hearing it. Oh my gosh, your English is amazing. I'm like, thank you. And I know the thing that is behind that, really. The saying is,
Mm,
your people usually don't sound like this. It's
mm.
surprising and shocking that there's education, that there's bilingual. And actually, in my town,
Yeah.
we have a large bilingual population because in my town, specifically in Honduras, access to going to a private bilingual school was way cheaper than in other parts of the country because going to private bilingual school usually also meant you were rich, like even that, like
Right.
learning and
Right.
but in my town we had a large population of like bilingual people because it was accessible. Like it was like for the middle class people, we were able to access that and pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but when coming here and hearing that consistently, like, oh, your English is so good, so it's like it's shocking. And even to the point, there were people that said, like, oh, I so wish that other people would speak like you do. And I'm
I
like,
was just about to say, so I feel like I'm gonna insert something real quick, and I feel like there's this because obviously like I've never been to Honduras. I will
yeah,
go one day, I'm pretty sure.
yeah, girl, you're coming with
But
me. You're coming with me.
yeah, I gotta come see it. But I've traveled a good bit,
Yeah,
way more than a lot of my friends and family, and so I feel like when I get to these places, it's very, very tempting to expect everyone to understand English because English is a very
yeah,
primary language.
it
And so it's
is.
very
It is.
tempting. But I
Mm-hmm.
think it's one of those things where I've become way more conscious and aware of, even if I'm in someone else's home or place or country or whatever, not having that innate expectation that their
Yeah.
English is going to be something that I can understand well, and
Mm-hmm.
knowing that, look, I know if I were speaking their language, I would be butchering the heck out of it. So
Oh,
why do I feel such a, and why do I feel like such a standard of like, oh,
mm,
they should have a certain standard of English so that I can
tell us,
understand them?
Anna.
Because
Tell
then
us.
that's coming back to me,
Yeah.
right? Like that's
Eh,
something like
yep.
I'm expecting for my own game. But it's like,
Yep.
that's the beauty of traveling, I think, is that you're able to like put yourself to the side. You're able to put, like you talked about, the stereotypes, the preferences that and the biases that we all
Oh,
have.
yeah. Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
able to just say, it's not about what I get out of this.
Yeah.
It's about just being able to be in another culture and embrace a different perspective. But I will say, like, and that's the challenge. I think, like, I just went to Turkey this year,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, Turkish is like, woof, it's a lot. But at the same time, like, I found me and the girls that I went with, like, trying to communicate out of like a sincere, like, wanting to know more.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what should we do? And, asking locals like certain questions and just about themselves too. Like, do you like it here? How old are you? Like, certain
Mm-hmm.
things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of their responses were like, I'm sorry, like my English is not good.
Yep.
And,
Mm-hmm.
they couldn't communicate really,
Mm-hmm.
but not making them feel less than, and not making them feel um like embarrassed, because I could tell a lot of them were like embarrassed because they were just like,
Yes.
I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. And it's easier just to like,
Yeah. And
just
let's
like
go there,
not say
Anna,
anything. Yeah.
because as someone who received Americans a lot of times, we would encourage them. We actually told them it's okay to make mistakes. Like, and I still
Yeah. Yeah.
reminded John because he's very aware of that. He's like, oh my gosh, but I don't want to say it wrong. I'm like, just say it. And no one ever made fun of him in that sense of like made him feel
Yeah.
bad for him having an accent ever.
That's what we were like,
Come
look,
here
you're
though.
trying to speak English. It's great. Like
Yeah.
I don't want you to feel like you're less than by any means, I
But
think
you
that's
come
important.
here, and you know why he was apologizing, Anna? Because that has been the attitude of anyone that has an accent here in the US. It's like, well, I mean, I
Mhm.
literally heard like when my mom still lives in Honduras. When she had visited me and we have gone to certain parts, and someone from church, like we're not talking like someone from church,
Yeah.
and another church, not my church, but another church. We were going through to a wedding and seeing other people. Oh, you're here. You should be speaking English.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, lady, when you have gone to our country, because you have, never once did we make you force something that one, it's not your context, right? But how dare you
Right.
tell that to my mom who is visiting? Also, at this point, and they're in the process right now, speaking of like of moving here, and I'm terrified of so many
Yeah.
things with that for them and how their experiences. I can't protect them of that, but that's a reality of like
Right.
I looked at her and said, was just like, what? Like my brain was trying to compute of like just that expectation. And that's where as a someone from another country, the superiority we continuously get from Americans. And like
Mhm.
this is the
Mhm.
expectation. And if you're here, this is the standard. And it's
Right.
funny because I am even so self-conscious everywhere I go of how I sound and how I speak, even though people are like, oh, you have a perfect English and all that. But I have been made fun of when I say something wrong before, or like,
Mm-hmm.
that was
Yeah.
funny. Oh, you said this instead of that. And I was like, I am speaking in a whole different language. Like, you understood the 99% of the other words that I
Yeah.
said, but that one, you had to go out of your way to make fun of it. Like,
Mm,
and that is something that is a struggle within anyone, because here's the thing. And when someone here in America that is not exposed to a lot of cultures, like, 'cause that's another thing too.
right.
Here's someone with an accent, where their brain goes is like, you have an accent, you have a lack of education. You are not
Oh,
smart enough.
exactly.
You are
And that's
not,
where
and
if
that's the
they're
assumption.
surprised, then it's like, "Oh, where's your education from?"
Exactly.
Because I didn't expect
Oh,
that out of
everyone,
you.
oh, Anna,
Yeah.
everyone asks
Yeah.
me if I grew up here and but did you come to school here? And I'm like, no, I received all
Yeah.
of my education in Honduras.
Yeah,
My
believe it or
primary,
not, there's other education
elementary,
out
I
there.
went to high school in Honduras. I went to college in Honduras. And let me tell you,
Mhm.
at this time, John and I just want to name this too, because John and I were in college, both of us. He was in college here in the US, in private college, and I was in my college in Honduras. And he said it's the same thing. He actually told me
Yeah.
he actually helped me with some of my projects. He's a finance guy and numbers guy. I'm not that. So I'm like, hey babe, can you help us with this? And he
Yeah.
would help us with the numbers. And he was like, some of your projects are actually harder than the ones that I do, because we had to like
I
come up
believe
with
it.
so many things. And so people consistently underestimate
Mm.
education in other places.
Yeah, and I
So
know when we talked to Emelisa and she shared her story, she said the same
yeah,
thing with at least coming to that the rural town that she moved to in
yeah,
Texas. So
you're
I mean I
stupid. Yeah, because of where you come from. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I could totally see that. Okay, so this is so good, but I was just curious. So tell us a little bit more about you kind of hinted at, the Lord giving you community when you got
Mhm.
here and
Mhm.
the church that you guys got established with. But is there any other ways that you saw where like God was in your story of immigration?
Oh,
Like where have you seen God
1000%.
in your story?
Oh, well, first it's in scripture. I think that when you grow up in one context and where you are um the majority, you
Mhm.
see and experience scripture in a different way. So, when I moved here and became an immigrant, all those verses talking about immigration, because immigration is all over the Bible, right?
Right.
So
Right.
many of the disciples themselves, went from town to town, culture to culture, experience to experience,
Mhm.
Jesus himself had to flee from his, context. Anyway, that became alive to me. That became like,
Mm.
oh, Jesus gets it. Like when in
Hmm.
like he gets my experience. We
Right.
see it there. There's people that you know went through a shift in cultural experiences, and we're foreigners in a land and experience discrimination. It's there. I mean,
Yeah.
experience what it was to be a foreigner. I mean, the Israelites themselves were foreigners in their land, um,
Right.
in another land. So that to me became, so I was able to experience Jesus in a different way, if that
Do
makes
you feel
sense.
like
And
that brought you closer to God?
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely, 1000%. I think it allowed me a different perspective, a different shade of like, oh, this is who you are, God, too, And now that that
Yeah.
has become my experience, I get to see you from a different light that before I
Yeah.
was not able to see it or appreciate it and hold
Mm.
space for it.
That's
Um,
good. Yeah.
so for sure I was able to just grow deeper with Jesus in that way and know that
Mhm.
he gets it, and that
Yeah.
I can bring this pain, because I think I went through a little, like, when you go through cultural identity crisis, that's a real thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
You go through that and you're like, you feel so alone and so misunderstood. I'm like, no one gets it.
Yeah.
No one
Yeah.
understands what I'm going through. It's very lonely. I'm like, I can share some of these things with my friends, even, who are incredible and love me so well. It
Hmm.
There were aspects that they just couldn't understand, so it felt lonely. And then I'm like,
Yeah.
but in the source, the Bible, scripture, There's life there. There's message. There's things there. Like where there's a verse in Psalms, like God protects the stranger.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, he's protecting me. He's before me. He is with me. And it has taken in 6 years a long time for me to continue to figure, to lead into that and remember that, because there are so many times that I'm reminded of that this is still feels strange in some ways. But that I do have my comfort, my hope, he's my source, in that, and then that has led now, when you talk about community, for me to immigration now has become a missional thing for me too. Like I remember God laid it on my heart. It's like a couple years ago, I was very frustrated. I was just feeling like the weight of things, and he just laid it on my heart, and he was like, but you're going to be a missionary here with your story. And I was like,
okay.
Sure, God.
If you say so.
And it's been great. Difficult at times. There are times that I'm tired. I'm like, oof, of explaining, on teaching or educating. But also I see it as a missional ground for me. Like, hey, I get to share of Jesus in a different context. I get to share like what it was like growing up for me. And not only that, but like, hey, you can learn from my people. You can learn from my culture. There are things that we actually do really well. We're very resilient. We're very, that there are things that you can learn from, like a different way of life.
And that is actually a perfect transition, because I was just going to say, to kind of wrap this up, how do you feel like, because we've been talking to, we've been sharing other people's stories. And first of all, just thank you for sharing your story. The vulnerability is real, and I know that's not easy. So I just wanted to publicly say thank you. I know your heart, and it is so pure, and I'm glad that God brought you to the States so that we can be friends. But
yes, right.
I know, but I just want to say, I just want to ask, before we wrap up, just how can we learn from immigrants? And if we're not, obviously, like you said, like no one gets it. Like I don't know if I can.
For sure.
It feels lonely at times, I'm sure. Even 6 years in, like you said.
Oh yeah.
So how can we learn from immigrants and their experiences and their stories, but also love them well? Because I feel like that's what we've been asking since this is the Love Well podcast.
No, that's great. Thank you for also making space for me to also share.
Of course.
I'm so glad that I am sharing, and I have a space and a voice where I can not only talk about my experience, but also like bring to the forefront, my people, and so that for me is weighty, and it represents a lot. So I'm just honored that I am able to even be in this space and have the access to be able to do so. Loving well immigrants. I think I'm hit it on the nail of like, don't assume. And I would want to go further with that. And it's like, listen to us. Listen, like listen to our stories, ask questions. Like I want to say, don't be afraid to ask questions, as long as you do it with a curiosity, without assumption,
Right.
Because I think those are the differences.
Or a judgment.
Yes.
Because I'll say real quick, like I feel like even just you sharing your story and talking about how little things, like I think what I would say, like just from hearing all the stories that we've talked about, is like the little nuanced things. We just, as people that are from, like Americans, we're from here, it's easy to just like overlook those things. And like you said, it's secondhand. We just do it by nature. But like as little as like what you said, like not pumping your own gas, like those sort of things, I'm sure that brought about some stares, or some like people that are like, what is she doing? How does she not know how to pump her own gas? Like, you know what I mean? So like even just like, kind of like yielding the judgment. Because you don't know.
So good. Yeah, you don't know what a person is going through. So I think, Also I would say if you see someone in need, because I've actually experienced this, like when I was at the DMV, there was someone that could not, and I mean, this one's a specific personal example, but you can do it in so many different ways. When you see
Mm-hmm.
someone that is not able to speak English in
Yeah.
need,
Yeah.
help them if you can, or
Yeah.
approach them and not
Yeah.
just do, but ask them, hey, can I help you?
Google
Because they're,
Translate is your
yeah,
friend.
look, I mean, my mom, when she visits, she's so cute. She has gone through the grocery store, and she's like, one moment, please. And then brings it
I
and
love
says,
it.
and shows it to like a representative. Um, which I would have never done. I'm so much more afraid than she is. She's just like, I don't care. But even that, like, don't be afraid to pull up, like, and just like, hey, can I help you? Because I think that
Mm-hmm.
there's so much power in that. Like when we are immigrants and we're
Yeah.
figuring it out, we're like, everything is overwhelming. You're so aware of how people are seeing you, and depending on where you come from, because that's the other thing too, or what you look
Yeah.
like, that will
Yeah.
also change.
Yeah.
Because my experience is different than my brother who is darker skin, and
Right. Right.
so it's also that, we're like so scared at the beginning. So when
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
a smile, also a smile, a smile
Mm.
goes like something as simple as a smile has so much power. Where I have been made feel comfortable is like a smile has power, guys. Like let's,
That's
it
good
does.
because, like you said, it creates a comfortable space.
It does. And it's like it's
It
a
kind of
welcoming
breaks
thing.
that
It breaks
barrier.
the, yeah.
Yeah.
And even if you're not able to communicate with someone, your body language, it's a
Mm-hmm.
universal language,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
everyone can tell, your approach, a smile, and just say like, hey, can I help you? And
Yeah.
some people will say no, and that's okay. Respect, that if they want to do it in their own way. But a lot of people will say yes, thank you, and that is something that
Yeah.
I can promise you they will never forget. As I
That's so
haven't
good.
forgotten, I haven't forgotten the kindness that I have gotten from strangers and people. Like when and especially after I've experienced like really awful things that people have told me or assumed about me, and
Mm,
they've gone to defend me, and I'm like, I've never forgotten that.
I bet. Yeah.
I'm
That
like,
is so
so
good, Marlene. I
yeah.
love it. I love
So love
it.
well, there are so many ways, and as somebody said, like, don't assume. The ask, how can I love you? How can I learn from you? Ask questions, be curious. You'll get to see more of God. You'll get to see more of his expression through a different culture and a reality. And I think that's just beautiful. So yeah, and be, welcoming. Like, and that's not that has nothing to do with culture. That's scripture. That's scripture.
Yeah.
You know
Oh
what?
yeah.
Yeah.
That
So
that really is more just loving well too.
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Anybody can use a smile. Well, I hope
Yeah.
you guys were just as excited to hear as I was this episode. Make sure you check out some of our other stories that we were able to record to see the other stories that we have. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. This has been great,
Yes.
Marlene.
Yes.
Thank
Thank you everyone
you.
for listening.